Story 1. When I was 10, living in downtown Los Angeles, I met the rapper DMX while he was filming the movie Cradle to the Grave. He kept telling me how important education is and to always take it seriously and stay in school to make something of myself. At the time, I was living in poverty in the Bristol Hotel off 8th and Olive Street. Now I'm 33 and a licensed professional engineer. Rest in peace, DMX. Story 2. Just a few hours ago, I was at a convention cosplaying as Jack Sparrow. The cast of Reno 911 was there and I walked past their booths. They were all in character, approached me, interrogated me, searched me, and arrested me. Then I escaped and ran away from them as they chased me, complete with a playful, son of a b*********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** of cops for fun. Story 3. I had lunch with Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. She was a wonderful person and very nice. Story 4. I had a pleasant conversation with Muhammad Ali and his wife while delivering and setting up medical equipment in their home a few years before his passing. Story 5. This happened in the early 1990s. I handled security at a large corporate hotel in a Canadian city. Any big-name group that performed in our city stayed at our hotel. I was escorting Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers from their guest floor to the lobby for their limousine one morning at 4:30 a.m. I am 6 feet 5 inches tall, and when Miss Parton approached me as I stood outside the elevator, she said in her sweet southern voice, "You all sure grow them big up here in Canada." She touched my arm in a friendly manner. She was just as sweet as pie. I blushed and instantly forgot everything about my job. Kenny did not even look at me as he boarded the elevator. I had put the elevator into individual use so it would stay on the floor with the doors open, but I had taken the keys with me. When it was time to descend to the lobby in my flustered state, I forgot which of the roughly 30 keys on the ring controlled that elevator, despite having worked there for several years. There was a long pause while I searched the key ring, key by key, 2 or 3 times. Kenny was glaring at me the whole time, barely concealed rage bubbling just under the surface. I finally found the right key, but when I went to put the elevator back into group service in my haste, I fumbled and dropped the keys. Kenny made a loud, exasperated sound, but Dolly came to my defense, touching my arm again and saying, "Sugar, you just take your time. We're in no hurry. Don't you pay him any mind." Kenny made another noise, but Dolly gently shushed him. We eventually made it to the lobby, and I escorted them to the carport and their waiting limousine. Kenny never even looked at me as he walked out the door and got into the car. Dolly, however, stopped to chat with me for a bit, thanking me for being up so early. I was on the midnight shift, and then tipped me a $100 bill. That was more than I made in a day back then. She did the same for the bellman who had brought their luggage down. Total class act. That was my most favorite and least favorite celebrity at the same time. Story 6. I met John Goodman at a coffee shop where I was working as a teenager. At the time, I used to watch Roseanne on Nickelodeon at night almost every night, and I told him I was a big fan of his in that show. He replied, "Well, there's no accounting for taste in the world." Story 7. On the night before I left my restaurant job to go to basic training, I waited on the actor who portrayed J. Peterman on Seinfeld. He made a grand show of delivering a dramatic send-off message in his J. Peterman voice. Spoiler alert, his J. Peterman voice is the same as his regular voice. Story 8. I worked in New York City advertising, and there was a rumor that Katharine Hepburn lived on one of the streets we frequented for lunch. We confirmed it as a group one lunchtime when her newspaper was still on the gate. A few weeks later, while I was walking up the street with my lunch, I saw the housekeeper putting out the trash. I smiled and nodded, then took 3 steps and did a literal double take. It was her in a cute headscarf. She smiled in amusement at my reaction and went back inside. Story 9. In the 1980s, I was a photographer for a major newspaper, and I received an assignment to cover Frank Sinatra at a small reception. Since I was the only photographer present, I stood at a discreet distance and photographed him with a long lens. After about 5 minutes, Frank looked straight into my camera and crooked his finger at me, motioning for me to come closer. I walked toward him, thinking that he might be angry or that I would be asked to leave. He asked who I was and what newspaper I was with. Then came the surreal part. He asked, "So, what do you think about Fujifilm? I've been getting into photography and I've always used Kodak, but now my friends are telling me to try Fuji. So I figured I'd ask a professional. Do you use Fujifilm? What do you think?" I told him I used Fuji sometimes, but more often Kodak, and I ended up having a 10-minute discussion about film brands with Frank Sinatra. He thanked me for my time, said he'd look for my photo in the next day's paper, and continued talking to the other guests. It was truly a surreal experience. Story 10. In 1976, I sat in a backyard in Phoenix, Arizona, and had a pleasant chat with Jimmy Carter. We were waiting for a political barbecue to begin. Carter, then a former one-term governor of Georgia, was running for the Democratic nomination for president. He was extremely nice and gracious to me. Back then, though, few people believed he had any chance of securing the nomination. He did, of course, and went on to win the general election against Gerald Ford. President Carter lived to be 100 years old. Rest in peace, Mr. President. Story 11. While performing an extra duty at the airport with Homeland Security, I noticed a woman struggling to place her luggage on the conveyor belt. "Can someone give me a hand?" My partner and I looked over and saw it was Eva Mendes. My partner offered assistance first. Story 12. I met Quentin Tarantino at Amoeba in Hollywood one afternoon, possibly in 2017. I cautiously approached him, said hello, and thanked him for all he's done for us. He smiled, asked my name, introduced himself, and we talked for a few minutes before I thanked him again and excused myself. He was an absolute gentleman, and it was a great experience to speak with him. Story 13. Recently, I had a brief interaction with RuPaul. He called me a true prince for assisting him with something. Days later, I realized that the queen of all drag queens referred to me as a prince. I asked my wife if that made me a drag prince. Story 14. I met Richard Kind once on an elevator 20 years ago. He was super friendly. It was a 15-second interaction, but he seemed genuinely delighted to be approached by a teenage fan. He is a sweet guy. Story 15. I have several celebrity encounters from working at comic conventions. One time, I was walking with Margot Kidder through the service corridors of the convention center. My job was to escort her to and from her question and answer session. On the way over, she told me all kinds of Hollywood stories, including when she and William Shatner, who was also a guest at the same convention, presented an Academy Award together. On the way back, we rounded a corner and encountered some Star Trek, the Next Generation actors being taken to their event. Marina Sirtis threw open her arms and excitedly cried out, "Margot Kidder!" The two of them embraced in an enthusiastic hug. The group then continued down the corridor. After we had gone a short distance, I asked Margot, "So how did you get to know Marina Sirtis?" She replied, "Oh, is that who that was?" I wondered. Story 16. Leslie Jordan was at a bar and spent 45 minutes with my partner and me sharing hilarious stories about his life. Story 17. John Hodgman, known from the Mac and PC advertisements from 20 years ago, once took my credit card. I was at a comedy event where there was a post-show gathering at the bar. I was sitting at a table with several other attendees, including Mr. Hodgman. I paid for a drink with my brand new credit card. He noticed it, said it looked cool, and asked to see it. I agreed, and he quickly placed the card in his wallet, advising me never to trust strangers, even if they're famous. He later returned it after I had learned my lesson and promised to be more cautious. Story 18. I used to do social work in Vancouver. I can't tell you how many random acts of kindness I've heard about. Story 19. Anthony Bourdain taught me how to break someone's kneecap and then made me practice it on him until I had it perfected. I met him during a jiu-jitsu class and ended up seeing him at several more, which allowed us to become pretty friendly. He was a kind and warm soul, and he had a remarkable presence about him. Story 20. Ben Stiller acted in a movie titled Fresh Horses, which was filmed on the university campus where I worked. The cast also included Molly Ringwald and Andrew McCarthy. I had the opportunity to meet Ben's parents, and Mira and Jerry Stiller, whom I admired as a comedy duo in the 1960s. My kids are impressed that I met Ben. I was in awe meeting Stiller and Mira. Story 21. I was going to a meeting in Los Angeles, and Warren Beatty was also going to a meeting in a large office building. The security guard asked me, "Sorry, sir, who are you?" I replied, "This is Warren Beatty. He's one of the greatest actors and directors of all time. You should see the girlfriends he's had." Warren then said, "Hey, thanks, kid." I was probably 38 at the time. Story 22. I spent a weekend with Jamie Lee Curtis and her family in central Idaho when our rental cabins were next to each other. She was very down to earth, friendly, and basically adopted me for the weekend to spend time with her kids. I think I was 10 years old, and this was around the year 2000 or 2001. Story 23. I ran into Philip Seymour Hoffman several times on the streets of Toronto during the Toronto International Film Festival around 2000 to 2001. By the end of the festival, he thought he knew me and would nod and say hello. Story 24. I met and spoke with Obama twice while he was president. He is a super engaging man who focuses solely on you when talking to you. Story 25. About 15 to 16 years ago, we were invited to a lecture given by Leonard Nimoy. He spoke mainly about his childhood, growing up in Boston, his family, his school, and his Jewish upbringing. We arrived early and sat in the front row. Our daughter brought along an old blueprint of the USS Enterprise from the original series, which my husband had picked up at a Star Trek convention in the 1970s. After the lecture, he came over and sat in the empty seat next to us. He not only signed the blueprint, but also spent about 20 to 30 minutes chatting with us. Honestly, he could not have been nicer or more gracious. Story 26. I used to work for Calvin Klein, and I was on set with Bella Hadid. She told me she loved my ring and that all day she thought I looked like Jake Gyllenhaal. My heart almost exploded. Story 27. I drank and hung out with Johnny Galecki in a hotel bar in Savannah while stationed there. He was a cool guy and offered me a job in private security as I was weeks away from getting out. He gave me the number of his bodyguard, but I never followed up because I didn't want to move to California at that time. I also moved a car on a studio lot for Leslie Jones while working transportation on a film in Los Angeles for my cousin, who was a transportation captain. She had not yet made it big and drove a Corolla with an ashtray filled to the brim with hundreds of joint remnants. Story 28. My dad knows Rowan Atkinson. They meet at car shows and talk. He is a friendly person who enjoys cars. Story 29. I met Clint Eastwood on my honeymoon when he was mayor of Carmel. He was a cool guy and was on his way to play golf at Pebble Beach. He congratulated us, joked a bit, and signed a couple of autographs. He told us to come by the Boar's Head that night, and if he happened to see us, he'd pick up the tab. Of course, we went, but we got there kind of late because it was our honeymoon. The staff said he left about 30 minutes before we arrived. I also met California Governor Jerry Brown at the Ford Assembly Plant in Milpitas, California because I was in the local high school band. My dad worked there too, just like 3/4 of the town's kids. It was a big deal for the governor to visit our little town back then. Story 30. I went to a neighborhood tavern to grab a couple of drinks with a friend one afternoon. I sat down, ordered a round, and then looked to my left to see Dave Grohl seated there by himself. The three of us watched the bar's television and talked casually like regular people. Story 31. I sat next to Joe Pesci at a crowded Italian restaurant by chance. I was sitting at the table directly next to him, but the place was so packed that I was almost in his lap. We talked for about 45 minutes and he was really cool. He told me they used to stab guys with big arms like mine with kitchen knives back in the day. He picked up the steak knife from the table and made a stabbing motion toward my arm. My arms aren't that big, though, which made it kind of funny. Story 32. I received a voicemail from Vince Vaughn. A friend of mine was in New Orleans for Mardi Gras and, predictably, had too much to drink. He called me in the middle of the night, but my phone was on silent, so it went to voicemail. It went something like this. Friend, you'll never guess who I'm hanging out with. Tell him who I'm hanging out with. Vince. This is Vince Vaughn. Friend. You're really tall. How tall are you? Vince, I'm 6 feet 5 inches. Friend, who's a few states away, that's really tall. Dude, you need to come here and have a drink with us. At that point, Vince took the phone and said my friend was very drunk, but I shouldn't worry because he'll make sure he gets back to his hotel safely. When my friend finally woke up the next day, he sent me a picture of him and Vince at the bar the night before. Story 33. I met Fred Willard in downtown Upland. I was walking around at noon with a couple of friends and noticed that he looked somewhat disheveled. He was wearing baggy clothes and seemed to be wandering around. When I got closer, I recognized him. I shook his hand, and then a week later, I found out he was caught in a scandal at a public theater while wearing a similar outfit to the one he had on when I met him. Story 34. One time in high school, Mike Myers went through the drive-thru of the fast food restaurant where I worked, pretending to be a grumpy old lady. I was 15 at the time, and I only remember two things. He was really nice once he revealed himself at the window, and he ordered chili. Story 35. Decades ago, a friend introduced me to an attractive lady. I asked what she did for a living, and she replied that she was a singer-songwriter. I remarked that it was a difficult career but might be worth it if she was determined. My friend frowned at me, but she smiled. Months later, another friend of mine mentioned that my first friend was friends with Sarah McLachlan. Story 36. In the mid to late 1980s, Johnny Marr accidentally spilled something on my shoe while we stood next to each other at the restroom trough at the Riverside in Newcastle. He probably still remembers it to this day. Story 37. Shane Jacobson is not a particularly famous person. I was in an airport lounge and saw him with his family. People were approaching him for brief chats and selfies, but I thought it better to leave him alone. I went to the bar to get a beer, and he stood next to me. I quickly said hi and mentioned that I liked his work. He asked if I wanted a selfie, but I said no, it was fine. He thanked me and expressed that he was happy to hear I liked his work. The bartender asked what we wanted, and we both ordered a beer. We had a brief chat while waiting. When the beers arrived, we wished each other a good trip, and he jokingly said, "Don't worry, mate, I've got these," referencing the fact that all the drinks in the lounge are free anyway. It was just a small encounter, but it made me like him more. Story 38. My college roommate and I took a picture with Andre 3000 just as he came off the stage after an Outkast concert in 2000. Felt like a commercial. We were eating free samples of mints from a college fair. We saw the crew setting up for the concert and decided to ask if we could help in exchange for backstage passes. I vacuumed the turf around the field, and we got to see the show from the edge of the stage. Afterwards, we took a picture together. Story 39. I met the actor Michael Kelly in Baltimore when they were filming House of Cards. I was the only person around who recognized him. I said, "Mr. Kelly, I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know how much I appreciate your work, and I want to thank you for making such great entertainment." He was the most gracious, down-to-earth person ever. We talked for about 5 minutes, mainly about the different characters he had played and what filming was like. Finally, he said, "Come on, don't you want a selfie or anything?" I replied, "No, honestly, I just appreciate the chat." He insisted, "Get your phone out. Come on, let's do this." We took a nice selfie together. The man has been in many movies and television shows. It's impressive. He's had a great career and was at the peak of the Doug Stamper popularity. He is just a really humble, nice person. Story 40 years ago, when Ben Affleck was married to Jennifer Garner, I was second in a traffic line. A church nearby had caught fire, but the flames had been extinguished. For an unknown reason, a person from the church was stopping traffic. I was about to get out and ask him to move because everyone has somewhere to be when Ben Affleck got out of the car in front of mine, and the starstruck church volunteer moved aside so traffic could pass. I turned to my partner to say, "That looks just like..." She replied, "Yeah, that's him." Story 41. I had lunch with Brian Blessed once, which largely consisted of him and my stepdad talking about movies while I, a shy teenager, said nothing the whole time. I ended up at Cuba Gooding Jr.'s house before he became super famous for his birthday party. He was out of plates and served me spaghetti in a measuring cup. Apparently, I dodged a bullet with this one, considering the stories that have come out about him, and I was a teenage boy at the time. I didn't get any creepy vibes from him. Story 42. I was in the bathroom of the resort in Florida where I worked in the 1980s. It also served as the customer bar bathroom. I was washing my hands when I heard someone in the men's room stalls having a really hard time, as it sounded like a bad case of the runs. There was a loud rip followed by a big grunt from the guy. The stall door opened, and out walked Lee Majors, known as the $6 Million Man. He looked rough, and I felt a bit starstruck, which he noticed. After washing his hands, he headed out to the bar, visibly intoxicated. I went to the bar and sat a few seats away from him. He started chatting with one of the resort owners, an older man named Nino. They began discussing their wives, and Lee asked, "Do you want to see a picture of my wife?" Nino replied yes. Lee reached into his wallet and handed Nino a picture. Nino exclaimed, "Holy crap, this woman is naked." At the time, Lee was married to a Playboy playmate. He started laughing hysterically, and Nino walked away, cursing under his breath. Story 43. I was seated at a table next to Hugh Grant about 10 years ago at a restaurant in West London. He was having a disagreement with a woman, and they left before finishing their meals. Later, I looked him up and discovered that she was one of the two women with whom he has children. He has 5 children from those 2 women within the span of 4 years, and they were arguing about his behavior. Story 44. About a month ago, I was in McDonald's with my youngest daughter and saw a man who looked exactly like Jack Black. I pulled up a picture to compare, and I couldn't believe it. I was showing my daughter pictures, but I didn't say anything because this was probably just a random guy who resembled him. I also wasn't going to take his picture to show anyone, since I didn't want to seem like I was bothering some random person. I was in a smaller town in Louisiana, so why would Jack Black be here? I kept sneaking glances to try to figure it out. Anyway, he left, I left, and I was just left wondering. About a week later, I was in Olive Garden with both my daughters, and guess who walked in? Jack Black. My younger daughter burst out laughing, which made me start laughing too. They escorted him into another room where I couldn't really see him anymore. But now my other daughter was struggling to understand why we couldn't stop laughing. That's the only celebrity interaction I've ever had. Oh, one time, President Obama was visiting New Orleans in the 9th Ward where I lived at the time, and that messed up my whole commute. I don't know if you'd call that an interaction. Story 45. I met Cher at a concert in Australia many years ago. She was very gracious and completely at ease just before going on stage. She is petite, wearing ripped jeans and a sequin tunic. Story 46. Leslie Nielsen asked me if I had hit my head. We were standing at a stoplight, and my bag had gotten hooked onto a pole that made noise when we went forward. Story 47. I can't say this is all that interesting, but when Demi Moore was filming We're No Angels in Mission, British Columbia, she rode with us extras from the parking lot most days. Story 48. Will Ferrell held the door for my partner and me at a gelato shop on Sunset Boulevard about 15 or 16 years ago. He was a cordial person. Story 49. I was walking through the park in Boston when I saw Bill Burr sitting on a bench. I looked at him, and he gave me a look that made me feel like I would be the subject of a 15-minute rant in his next special if I approached him. So I nodded and kept walking. Story 50. I met David Carradine at a party at his drug dealer's house. I was excited to see Grasshopper, but he turned out to be very unpleasant. I have met many famous people, but he was the most arrogant of them all. Story 51. I was working on the set of our Kelly's Trapped in the Closet video. He poked his head into the kitchen set we were painting and said, "Working hard or hardly working?" Story 52. I played beer pong with Claudio from Coheed and Cambria and Matt Pinfield from Music Television. It was an interesting night. Story 53. The first time I ever smoked cannabis, Hunter Thompson tried to get some from me, and I thought he was an undercover officer. My family owned a bar in Aspen that he often visited. Story 54. My dad has been a smoker for longer than I have been alive. He was fortunate to borrow a lighter from Samuel L. Jackson at Los Angeles International Airport. I felt so jealous. Story 55. The first professional wrestling show I ever appeared on in 1998 had quite a few former World Wrestling Federation participants, including Earthquake, Typhoon, and the star of the story, Doink the Clown. For those who don't know, Doink was exactly what it sounds like, a wrestling clown. In this case, he was portrayed by Steve Keirn, the second person to take on the gimmick in the World Wrestling Federation. Anyway, when I entered the locker room, I saw Mr. Keirn applying the Doink makeup and nodded hello. Later, I was talking with Earthquake, a super nice guy, when I happened to look up and see Doink standing there, wearing the clown makeup and nothing else. Naked and clown are two words that should never appear in the same paragraph, let alone next to each other in the same sentence. I still have not fully recovered. Story 56. In Los Angeles, I would step out to the parking lot at work to smoke a cigarette, and there was always this creepy man by his van. He would stare at me, which made me a little uncomfortable. This went on for months. I told my husband about it almost daily. One day, my husband came to have lunch with me. We were talking in the lot, and the creepy man was there. I pointed him out to my husband. He looked at me as if I was crazy and said, "That's Bob Dylan, you dummy." We both burst out laughing. This is one of my favorite stories from our time in Los Angeles. Story 57. I was on a flight and saw Pauly Shore. I said hello at the gate after landing. It's not very interesting, but it's the only interaction I've had with a famous person. He's a cool guy. Story 58. A Rod from the New York Yankees was trying to get with me. I sort of hung out with him most of the night at a club in New York City. I didn't hook up because I wasn't interested. He was a bit conceited, but not a bad guy. Story 59. I lived in Washington, D.C. a few years ago and was out in Georgetown with a friend. I saw a man at the bar who looked just like Sewage Joe from Parks and Recreation. While I was telling my friend who I thought it was, his companion turned around and looked identical to Kevin Nealon. I realized it actually was them when I remembered that Kevin Nealon had a show at the Kennedy Center that night. I told them both how much I enjoyed their work, and I thought that would be it. They ended up hanging out with my friend and me the whole night, and I had breakfast with them the next morning. They were both so nice and really fun to be with. Story 60. In the mid-90s, when I was 16, I worked for Loehmann's, a women's clothing store that featured group dressing rooms. This meant I had to watch women try on clothes to ensure they didn't steal them. The city I lived in was hosting an annual film festival that many famous people attended, and Angela Bassett came in to try on clothes. She tried on shirts and jackets in the dressing room, and I saw her in a way most people do not. When she finished, I politely took her clothes to rehang and put away. She was very nice and even more beautiful in person, and somewhat shorter than I expected. Story 61. I was in the backing band for an American pop star with a squeaky clean reputation. We disembarked in Sydney, Australia, and there was a large crowd waiting. They didn't look like our usual fans, much edgier, but we thought, oh well, it's Australia, and got ready to sign autographs. It was then we realized that the band Motorhead was on the same flight. All the people at the airport were there for Motorhead. Their disdain for us was palpable. We slunk away as quickly as possible, but it was definitely a Spinal Tap moment. Story 62. I met Justin and Hailey Bieber just after they had gotten engaged in the mall in his hometown. I tried to tell him a story about how I had a plastic ring with a picture of him from his early career, but I talk really fast when I'm nervous. I swear he thought I was drunk after I walked away. I've also met Bonnie Wright, who played Ginny in the Harry Potter series. I was trying not to talk too fast, which led to me barely being able to speak a full sentence. Sigh. Apparently, I get flustered around celebrities. Story 63. I had dinner with Ariana Grande and her parents before she became a television star and pop singer. She was very nice, around 13 years old at the time. It was a relaxed evening. We had a mutual connection and later saw her brother performing on Broadway. It was a great experience. Story 64. My friend got married at the hotel where Bruce Dern and Will Forte were staying while filming Nebraska. We ran into them at the hotel bar after the reception area stopped serving drinks. They bought the wedding couple a round of shots and then had another round with our group. Story 65. In the 80s, when I was little, I went to Chessington World of Adventures with my friend Darcy. While we were there, we saw Michaela Strachan at the height of her Wackaday fame. We waved at her and she waved back. Then we ran off giggling. Story 66. Corbin Burnson was filming a movie in my hometown, and my brother, a friend, and I joined the crew as volunteer production assistants. While one scene was being shot, Corbin stopped and said, "This scene needs more color." He then walked up to my brother and me, the only two black people on set at the time, and asked, "Do you two want to be background extras?" We agreed and got to be in the movie briefly, which was cool, but we still laugh about the way he phrased the situation. Story 67. I met Martin Freeman at a pop-up bourbon tasting in London. He was great. I also had dinner with Lachlan Monroe years ago, and he was delightful. Story 68. I attended Charles Barkley's private New Year's Eve party, where he humorously threw ice at people across the room while standing behind me. Story 69. My husband and I were at a gas station after leaving a Detroit Pistons game and met Dennis Rodman. He was getting gas at the pump next to ours, and we talked to him about the game. He was very friendly, and we shared some good laughs. Felt like running into an old friend. Story 70. When I was a teenager, Quentin Tarantino sat behind me when I went to see the opening of Jackie Brown on Christmas Eve. I was a huge fan and wanted an autograph on my ticket stub, but I waited for everyone to leave to avoid making a scene. It was just me, him, and a lady with a notepad who was taking notes during the movie. I told him I was a fan and asked for the autograph. He said the movie theater was like a church to him, and out of respect for the church, he would have to decline. Story 71. I sold merchandise for Les Claypool in 2013. It was my first night truly working at the venue. He gave me a free poster and asked if I wanted a drink, but only if none of his fans were around. We chatted for a few hours, primarily about family relationships and touring. It was not the conversation I expected, but it was great. My dad traveled a lot, so I could empathize with his children's feelings about tour life. Story 72. Paul McCartney and I talked about Disney pin trading. He pulled the lanyard around my neck and asked, "What's with these badges?" Story 73. Britney Spears was working with a restaurant that caters to the stadium, and I was on shift for her concert at that location. Her head of security came up to buy some food, and I offered him a huge discount if he could sneak me a peek. Not that I thought anything would come of it, but he got me backstage afterward. I spoke to her for about 5 seconds. She's really nice. Story 74. I saw Chris Noth coming off a basketball court in New York City a long time ago. He was very handsome and tall. He noticed that I was feeling weak in the knees, and he gave me a little smile. Story 75. Asher Roth brought the 17-year-old me on stage to dance with him. What an unusual concert, but I went along with it. Story 76. My wife and I visited a restaurant in Boston a long time ago. As we approached the front door, a couple of people walked out, including Richard Simmons. When the door was closing behind them, Richard turned around and rushed back, apologizing to us profusely. He held the door open for us as we entered. Story 77. When I was visiting Los Angeles for a few months, it seemed that every time I stood in line, Sarah Silverman was behind me. Each time, she gave me a big smile. Story 78. I used to work as a golf caddy in Los Angeles for a member who frequently hosted celebrities. Justin Timberlake would come out to golf from time to time. He remembered who I was and a few details about me, like where I was from. He smoked half a pack of cigarettes and advised me not to marry too early. He was a laid-back guy and a good golfer. Story 79. I was working at a restaurant when Sammy Hagar came in. I didn't wait on him, but there was quite a bit of fanfare with lots of pictures and excitement. Not exactly my scene. As I was leaving a table and he walked by, I quickly said, "I'm a big Grateful Dead fan, and you have this quote. Bob Weir isn't just the best at what he does. He is the only person who does what he does." I was never a huge Van Halen fan, but I think about you and that quote a lot. Away from the fanfare and pictures, Sammy Hagar and I chatted about music for about 10 minutes. Story 80. Nicolas Cage was at the East Bay Vivarium in Berkeley. I accidentally backed into him while waiting for help. We ended up chatting about what we were both buying. He was getting some spiders, and I was getting poison dart frogs. Story 81. I was working in an airport hangar when Callista Flockhart walked in. She was very polite and curious, so I was showing her around in hopes of getting her phone number. After a while, a tall, gruff man named Harrison Ford angrily exclaimed, "There you are! I've been looking all over for you. Let's go." She turned to me and gave me a sad look. I then watched them get into an old World War II-looking plane and fly away with him piloting it. Story 82. I met Tenacious D, and when Jack Black shook my hand, he held my grip and clasped his left hand over ours. I followed his lead and placed my left hand over both our hands. He gave me a fierce look straight in the eyes and yelled, "Blood pact." I was there with 3 or 4 other people. He shook everyone else's hands normally. Story 83. Once a year, Adam West would call George Barris. The phone's ringtone was the Batman theme. George would answer, "Just a minute, Adam. I'm with Jamie. Don't be so rude." The others in my group were astounded that I knew them. They would both share fresh gossip about cars, which helped attract more bus tour passengers to their meet and greet parties. I also sat at a bar that was closing for the night at the Stardust Hotel in Las Vegas, waiting for my wife. A guy sat beside me, and we exchanged comments for over 30 minutes in a very interesting conversation. I recognized him from somewhere. Finally, we parted ways, and the waitstaff said, "You didn't know who that was, did you?" I responded, "Oh, sure." They replied, "You better not go to his show tonight. He'll find you and roast you." When my wife showed up, we left the hotel and watched the marquee being changed to Don Rickles Tonight. I wanted to go to the show for sure, but I couldn't. Rest in peace, Adam, George, and Don. Story 84. My rabbit growled at Donald Trump when he walked past us in the street. She also thumped her feet at him, which is rabbit for go away. This was the year before he first ran for president. Story 85. I ran into Maisie Williams in a shopping center in Cardiff while heading to a movie with some friends. I got a picture with her. That's all. Story 86. Harry Styles flirted with me at a photo shoot. I had never listened to his music before, but he was very charming and humble. I can see the appeal. Story 87. I met Justice Sotomayor at an event and expressed my admiration for her. I told her how much I appreciated her work and asked for a picture with her. She was incredibly kind. Story 88. I was at an art history museum in Vientiane, Laos, standing next to a woman. I turned to look at her, and 3 karate ninjas ran over and put up a barrier between us. I left immediately. I learned later it was the vice president of Vietnam. Story 89. I knew a couple of producers in Huntsville, Alabama. They kindly allowed me to go backstage when Craig Mack and Notorious B.I.G. were performing. Craig Mack invited my friend and me to join in on what they were eating before the show. We just relaxed and had a nice time. Then it was time for Craig to perform. I wanted to be backstage, but there was a large man in my way. I apologized for bothering him and said, "Excuse me," so I could get by. It was Biggie Smalls. His friend and bodyguard turned and said, "No autographs." I knew Craig Mack's Flavor in Your Ear, but I wasn't familiar with Notorious B.I.G.'s music, so I impulsively told him where he could stick his autograph and his negative attitude. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.